to recent conclusions reached by various experts from international think tanks, China's Belt and Road Initiative has an immense international effect and has brought strategic changes along the way. The need to act in times of great change is as relevant as ever, while the West's strategy to deal with the change proves to be controversial. How does the BRI fit into the New World Order? And what are the general perceptions and concerns over the Belt and Road Initiative? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. Zhao Hai from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Claire Pearson, former chair of the British Chamber of Commerce in China, and we shall also talk to Greg Earl, economic diplomacy columnist at the Lowy Institute via satellite. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to our show here in the studio. Now, the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Europe published an article recently saying that China's Belt and Road Initiative is a win-win approach under a globalist outlook, and also a way to soften its growing international influence by referring to cooperation, connectivity, and co-prosperity. Do you agree that basically this article has set tone for a very positive perception?
Yeah, I basically agree with the conclusion. And I think from the outset of the BRI project, people have, particularly in China, agreed that the win-win approach should be the fundamental approach of the BRI, and China wanted to cooperate with any country who wanted to participate. And in that respect, I think Europe is catching up. They have come up with their own project connecting Europe with Asia, and people are more and more focused on the potential of the Belt and Road region and countries, their potential of development and their future of economic development. China has try to connect with other countries not only through infrastructure but also through policy, through people-to-people connections, and there are more and more potentials now have been revealed that previously people don't know, and now we're investing in those regions. So I think the European countries and China have more in common in terms of developing this region and cooperate in many areas that we have different advantages of.
So Claire, don't you think it's a bit risky to take a European voice as a monolithic whole? There's not a single voice on, for example, BRI, to say nothing of the big Atlantic Ocean that divides the United States and the European Union with regard to the BRI. So basically, don't you think this initiative that China holds so dear proves a little bit controversial for Western countries?
Controversial is one word, or challenge is another, but I see it more like a cavalry call, more like a bugle, a wake-up call to the rest of the world that maybe there's a different way of doing development. I think that, yes, there's a multiplicity of opinions on BRI, but I think ultimately there's going to be benefit for the rich countries and the poor countries. Because I always think that the most innovative solutions to current global issues of migration and wealth disparity are going to come from different countries at different times. For example, post-World War II, Silicon Valley existed or came into existence as an innovation leader globally because electricians came back from World War II and settled in Silicon Valley. But in a way, China is in the position of being post-war on development. The last 30 years, it's lifted 500 million people out of poverty. BRI is just going to export this innovative know-how in development expertise to countries that stand to benefit from increased opportunity and realization of human potential through infrastructure initiatives. I'm a big fan of BRI. Most of the world would be happier if they had 50,000 USD per year as their GDP. Most countries on Belt and Road, some of them have 500 GDP. If this is going to reduce wealth inequality in the world, it's going to enhance safety. That's a global concern. It's good for everyone.
Different noises about the geopolitics or geoeconomics flared up recently in the wake of China's proposal of BRI. Let me cross over to Mr. Greg Earl, a senior journalist and scholar, for his analysis about what actually globalist outlook means for the future of the BRI. Can I have your thoughts on the implications of this proposal for Europeans?
Well, I think a lot depends on how much cooperation can be achieved between the BRI and some of the other global lending institutions. I'd say that probably the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is showing the way here by doing a lot more joint projects with the likes of the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank, and they're sort of exchanging knowledge, I think, doing that, and it's learning from the way they've done things. It's perhaps showing that these projects can be done faster than they have been done in the past.
Dr. Zhao, how does the Belt and Road Initiative challenge the persistent transatlantic-centered liberal world order? Since first in Europe, we've heard that we live in a post-truth world, a post-order world, or alternative truth might be the word to describe what happens in the 21st century.
Well, I think the World Economic Center has been in the Atlantic area for hundreds of years in the modern era. But after World War II, that gravity has changed gradually towards the Pacific. And now, the reason why during the Obama administration, the U.S. wanted to have a pivot to Asia policy is because the U.S. realized that the majority of the economic production is now coming from East Asia, and they wanted to refocus on East Asia. And if you combine East Asia's total GDP with the U.S., that's over 60% of the world GDP. So I think it's very clear that today the World Economic Center is in the Pacific, not in the Atlantic. Now we're just, so BRI is a reflection of that, but between the Atlantic and the Pacific, there's a huge belt and road area that is still underdeveloped. That is the aim of the BRI, trying to bring those countries and those regions into the global market so that trade and other development projects can go on to have to expand the market and to share the benefit. As the other panelists has pointed out, we have now a huge gap of rich and poor, not only in the developed countries but also in developing countries in the world. So how to have an inclusive globalization, that's our common question, our common challenge. And BRI is the solution, I think, for China to provide a win-win approach to solve the current problem.
Claire, by the end of the day, some people are afraid that it's not the issue of whether BRI would challenge the existing world order, but instead it should be a matter about how we look at the illiberal world order with the rise of populism, protectionism, unilateralism in particular that we face from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Do you agree?
Well, I must admit that I think that there's common problems leading to different issues. And increasingly, I think we don't need to see BRI as a competition between developed and developing countries. We need to see it as complementary. Or maybe we need to see BRI as a platform where the synergies from your companies and companies from the West can achieve a better outcome for people on the BRI. You know, I was just looking at the Global Fortune 500 earlier this afternoon. 126 of those companies are American, 120 are US. So what I see BRI is really promoting is it's forcing people to think, what do I need to do for my company to prepare it for the BRI century? Because I think Belt and Road really was set up for two reasons. You know, Xi Jinping launched it in 2013, and it was around that time that they set up Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Why? Because World Bank hadn't really caught up with the new economic reality vis-a-vis two areas: board diversity and shareholder representation. So if you look at ADB, which is really just a subset of World Bank, you're going to find that 26% of votes, 13% US, 13% Japan, are controlled by two countries. Do you know what China gets on the voting board of ADB, Asia Development Bank? 6%. So I know when I applied to the UK for a mortgage to buy a house, it's difficult because I earn in renminbi. So people who are applying for projects to develop Asia and the Middle East are going to want to apply in their own currency, in their own culture, and with their own cultural know-how of what needs to be achieved in the region. So you get AIIB set up to develop the part of the world that needs to develop itself in its own way. So I think that, I look at Jin-Li Kuhn, the guy who heads up AIIB. Look at his background. He's been a rice planter, he's been a teacher, he's been a Red Guard, he's been in People's Bank of China, he's been in CICC, one of the most sophisticated banks globally, and now he's at AIIB. China offers two...
By the way, he was deployed in Manila as the vice governor of ADB. And he had benefited enormously from his experiences with the AIB, the governance of Asia Development Bank.
I see him sort of in the sort of Lee Kuan Yew class or the Deng Xiaoping class. You give certain Chinese internationals, a view of the future, and they're sort of prophetic about where to make profit. And I see Jin-Li Kuhn's moves from World Bank to ADB to CICC to AIIB as just following the new curve of global innovation that can benefit people along the Belt and Road. Because let's face it, somebody who's planted rice but has been a global banker, is a polymath and a polyglot, is the sort of person you want to be leading global institutions, whether they're the World Bank or AIIB or a multinational company. So my view is that if companies from the West are going to benefit from BRI rather than sit on the sideline, they need to really think about the voting structure of their board and the nationality of their leader. Then the synergies can be appreciated for China, US, win-win on Belt and Road.
In fact, a few years ago, RMB started to be taken more seriously in what we call the Special Joint Rights Package to further internationalize our currency. Now, let me go back to Greg. Claire proves a bit dodgy on the issue of whether we live in a liberal world order, whether this order is being challenged by BRI. I'd like to, of course, she came up with her very independent and deep thoughts on implications of BRI for particularly voting rights of emerging markets in ADB or World Bank. Let me get back to Greg. What do you think of, the liberal world order? Does it still work, or it should be fine-tuned somehow with the help of emerging markets?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the BRI process has clearly emerged from the fact that China and some other countries, particularly India, think that they don't have a sufficient share of the voting rights, as my co-panelist has just pointed out, at the IMF in particular and the World Bank. And the fact that that problem hasn't been resolved for a long time has really motivated part of this BRI process. And I think that's unfortunate that that happened, and I think it still needs to be redressed. But I think we have to accept that the BRI exists now and that those institutions exist, and we have to find ways to find ways so that they can cooperate with each other on projects rather than compete. And that's now really the big challenge. I think we have to accept that the institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank will exist, and the other institutions will exist. And I think there is, as I said before, some sign that there's cooperation happening. I think that's a positive thing. I think with the BRI, there's a lot of uncertainty about its scope and scale. It's not a fixed program. There's some old projects in it, there's new projects in it. So I think there's still a bit of uncertainty about exactly how other institutions should plug into the BRI at the moment. And that's and I think so China has some obligation to try and explain this a bit more to those institutions.
Despite the negative impact, Dr. Zhao, of Brexit, Prime Minister Theresa May said during her visit to China that more efforts need to be made to promote transparency of a BRI, and she urges PRC to comply with the laws of the host countries so that this idea, despite its glow, would be more acceptable. What do you think of her concerns?
Well, first of all, I think the last question about liberal or illiberal is the wrong way to look at the current global governance. I think that's too ideologically charged. We should ask a question instead of whether or not the governance structure is effective and also multilateral, meaning that people are represented. So in that respect, I think the BRI proposal is really trying to address the problem of effectiveness, because previous structure is not good enough to, for instance, fill in the blank of the gap of infrastructure investment in the Asia-Pacific as well as in in other part of the region. And when other countries, developed countries, not only Great Britain but also Japan and other European countries, asking for transparency and accountability, that's understandable because they have higher standards. However, you have to consider how to apply those standards in the developing countries and how to adapt into the reality on the ground so that you can promote effective development, at the same time maintain certain level of transparency and accountability, not hindering the development. In many cases, like in Africa, what we witness the cases in which, yes, you have higher standard, you have very elegant projects. However, it's not widespread. The development of economic fruits are not shared among the public. So I think it's very important to rethink about the current developmental structure, international development assistance, and in that way, BRI is very creative in providing an alternative.
Let me go back to Greg. The understatement of a compliance with the laws in the host countries may indicate somehow, for example, in Malaysia, Dr. Mahathir decided to reconsider seriously the idea of constructing high-speed railway in his country, while charges were brought against his predecessor, Najib, on the issue of corruption. Therefore, don't you think that China also faces multiple challenges regarding the very issue of transparency?
Well, yes, I think the situation in Malaysia is of critical importance to the future of the BRI. I think it's because Malaysia was one of the first countries in Southeast Asia to recognise China, has a large Chinese population, a strong business relationship with China going back a long way. Now, Prime Minister Mahathir doesn't easily pigeonhole into the main geopolitical camps around the world. He's quite an idiosyncratic sort of character. And I think the fact that he is now trying to renegotiate the price of the East Coast Rail project is very significant for the future of the BRI, because it's one of the largest single projects in the BRI. It's certainly one of the largest projects in one of the more developed countries in the BRI. And I think Prime Minister Mahathir is really trying to push down the price. It seems one of his ministers said they were cancelling the project, but now he has come back and entered into government-to-government relationships, negotiations with China. I think he wants to maintain a good relationship with China. He just wants a cheaper price. This is going to be a really important test of the real economics of some of these projects, and will provide a real insight for a lot of other BRI countries as to whether they're perhaps being encouraged to pay too much for some of these projects. For example, there was a very interesting survey of about 1,000 opinion leaders in Southeast Asia published just recently. 65% of them said that they thought the BRI was a good thing and would deliver valuable infrastructure to Southeast Asia. But 70% of those people said they were concerned that their countries would wind up with excessive debt as a result of the BRI. So I think Southeast Asia is a really crucial part of the BRI system, where some of these issues are going to be resolved and other countries are going to be watching quite closely.
Exactly. One follow-up question very quickly, Greg. What do you think of the alleged debt trap, meaning the Chinese authorities or their enterprises deliberately build up a debt to somehow put the host countries into a kind of geo-economic trap, a geo-economic conspiracy trap? That sounds a bit funny for the Chinese, but such media fanfare continues to come from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, the American media.
Yes, well, I think one of the problems here is that there are so many projects in the BRI, possibly, and they are financed in many different ways by many different Chinese institutions. There's debt, there's equity, And so I think it's very confusing to get a handle on exactly what a classic BRI
One follow-up question on the case of Sri
more.
Lanka. Excuse me, Greg, let me focus on the issue of Sri Lanka, the Habatota port, which is very expensive, and for 99 years the Chinese enterprise will be able to enjoy free access to the port in Colombo, the capital city of Sri Lanka, and that has caused a huge debate in this very host country between the ruling party and the opposition. Also, the media in Sri Lanka, as well as that in India, cited the reason of national security as part of the reason to criticize China, to discredit China's BRI. What do you think of such a media fanfare?
I think what's interesting about Sri Lanka is that the BRI became part of an election campaign there, as it was in Malaysia, as it was in the Maldives, and a little bit in Pakistan. This is a new development with the BRI, that there is some debate in these countries about it, and I think this is something that China will need to manage a lot more delicately in the future.
Thank you so much, Greg, for being with us. You are watching Dialogue with Dr. Zhao Hai, Claire Pearson, as well as Greg Earl, to discuss the implications and global impact of a BRI, particularly controversial issues such as the debt trap and the export of overcapacity from China to developing countries. When we come back, we'll look at the legal and the political risks that Chinese face in developing countries when they seek to build infrastructure. Stay with us, please. Welcome back, Claire and Dr. Zhao. The issue of political and legal risks might be something that keep obsessing operators from China. For example, bipartisan politics in most of the host countries where we construct the high-speed railway may, serve to be more of a curse than a blessing when we look at the sustainability of BRI in those countries. Opposition party, when they took office, would accuse the previous government of being involved in corruption cases. So what do you think of such legal and political risks? Do you think this is a constant curse for our business presence in countries along the stretches of BRI?
I think BRI proposal is so expensive, and there are so many projects in it. It's bound to be troubled by political problems and argument domestically. So the debt trap, for instance, is really politicized in many countries, and the opposition party always wanted to use this as an excuse to show there might be corruption, the projects are too expensive, and they wanted
perhaps the environmental damage,
social issues, all kinds of things. Yeah, after they take power, what happened, if you look at Sri Lanka and also look at Malaysia and also other countries, is that in the beginning the new government would like to get rid or to basically get rid of the original contract. But later on, they realize there's benefit of those contracts, and they try to change the terms. And after renegotiation or some kind of compromise, they will continue with the project. So ultimately, they prove themselves wrong of accusing corruption or other issues. There might be issues. However, I think fundamentally they will realize the infrastructure projects contained in the BRI is good for their economy, for their country. So this political struggle ultimately will clear themselves, and the BRI will continue. So back to the original issue, I don't think one project in Malaysia or Sri Lanka or any other countries will make or break the BRI. The BRI is a long-term project that will have success and failures. However, I think if you look at the overall benefit of the BRI, countries, those countries will realize the benefits.
Clear, not all countries buy the idea of a BRI. I'm not talking about the United States, which listed China as a strategic threat. India, for example, because of the Kashmir line of control with Pakistan. Now, the issue is, do you think BRI can enjoy a peaceful competition with some of the major economies like India, Japan, which recently, last year, reluctantly accepted the idea when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came to visit China to commemorate the 40th anniversary of Peace and Friendship Treaty between the two governments. The United States recently, if you look at the report of a RAND company, says China is not a rogue state, but rather very serious strategic competitor and a challenger to the United States. If you put the India and the United States, for example, into one perspective, what do you think of, say, kind of a competition, if not rivalry, regarding BRI?
I think rivalry is very healthy. It's very good for business. Because let's think about it. We're in a global economic downturn. Fact. So how are voters in democracies like India or the US going to be choosing their leader? It's going to be what's the money in the back pocket. And the one thing about BRI I've noticed is the projects, where projects have already been undertaken, I'm finding returnees. I was in DC not too long ago, and the taxi driver I was chatting to was from Pakistan. He's returning to Lahore. Why? Because since the Gwadar port was built, GDP he's seen going up consistently year on year in his country. So, you know, places like India, they're subject to the same pressures. I was flying to Kunming recently, couldn't get a seat on the plane. Didn't used to be like that when you went to Kunming. Why is Kunming real estate going through the roof? Because BRI is going to join up Kunming, Chongqing, Chengdu, 100 million people, bigger than Shanghai and Beijing. Where's that market going to head? It's going to head into Myanmar. It's going to go down to Singapore. Why is Myanmar behind BRI? Because Myanmar wants to improve. I spent a lot of time in Yunnan about 15 years ago. What did I used to see from Myanmar? Drugs and malachite. You'd get malachite miners, really rough guys, coming over with rotary saws and selling malachite that they'd mined in Myanmar. Is that a good business for Myanmar? Is that developing the country? No. It's exploiting the people who get the malachite out of the ground and the profits made in the country where you can process it because you have infrastructure. Infrastructure gives added values to developing countries that are currently being robbed of their raw products. I think economic empowerment is what democracies are ultimately concerned with, particularly in an era where everyone's working 3 times as hard for half the pay. Ordinary people want infrastructure because reduced time on the road increases profits in small business.
Dr. Gao, let me go back to the issue of Japan, or ADB. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and his government made it clear that Japan might be part of the BRI project, not completely on China's terms. But what do you think of the chance for the two sides, Japan and China, to join hands in advancing the basic interests of the host countries that benefit supposedly from BRI?
Yeah, actually, Shinzo Abe, before BRI, he proposed to compete with China on the BRI, and he tried to encourage Japanese companies go along the BRI and try to compete with Chinese companies. And because the interest rate in Japan is so low, that he presumed that Japanese companies would compete with China willingly. However, what happened is that the Japanese companies see great risk, and they don't want to invest in infrastructure and other projects because they don't have comparative advantage in those areas with China. So, however, if you look at the picture, if you change your view and look differently, Japan has their own comparative advantage. If they combine their forces with China in third party, in the third market, they will both benefit. In Myanmar, for instance, Japan has been doing business in Myanmar for many years, and they have a very good network in Myanmar, and they have people's appreciation. However, they're doing a different side of like retail and selling a lot of consumer products in the region. However, if China is doing infrastructure combined with Japan's management and other skills, that will promote economy even faster. So I think one more word is that we can't just talk about debt, because debt and investment are the two sides of one coin. In many ways, people, if they just focus on debt, that's wrong. They need to realize that some of the debt accumulated in order to invest in the future.
You need to look at the balance sheet. That's why the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council says that the BRI is a win-win approach and a globalist outlook. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.